First of all, we know explicitly who the mastermind of the operation is. It is Paul Henri Sandaogo Damiba. We know the operational method that was chosen, namely armed violence. We know the objectives of this operational method. This military-style armed violence was aimed at assassinating President Ibrahim Traoré and
Tonight, Burkina Faso is not speaking through rumors, it is speaking through confessions. For the first time, alleged coup plotters are appearing on live television, describing secret contacts, encrypted messages, cash payments, and plans that authorities say were meant to destabilize the state. This is not a leaked document. This is not an anonymous source. This is not foreign media speculation. These are voices recorded on camera. Listen carefully.
I am Captain Koudiati Prosper from the 17th graduating class of the Jean Manon Military Academy in Pau, currently serving at the Air Force General Staff. I was arrested on January 2, 2026, following an attempt to destabilize the current government. I was contacted 2 weeks ago by Lieutenant Colonel Henri Sandaogo Damiba using a number from Togo. After several missed calls, when I finally answered, he introduced himself and asked me to install Zangui, which I did. He had me log into Zangui a few times to check in on me without saying anything else. I should mention that Colonel Damiba had my number for a long time. One day, Colonel Damiba contacted me to ask if I had the Signal app. I said yes. And he told me that someone would contact me on the Signal platform. Someone did indeed contact me on Signal on behalf of Colonel Damiba, and this person called himself King David. I want to clarify that King David is actually Captain David from the 14th graduating class. He is currently in Ghana. Over time, before the evening of December 31st, David and I would exchange messages, both among the older and younger members. As for Colonel Damiba, he would write to me, call me, but always with quotes. He spoke in parables and would ask if people were in good spirits, and so on. That being said, he never clearly stated from the outset that he had a plan. I also wanted to clarify regarding our conversations on Signal with King David that Captain Ouedraogo had suggested setting messages to disappear after 30 seconds. And also, when Colonel Damiba writes to me on Zangui, if I haven't read it after 10 minutes, he deletes the message. On the evening of December 31st, Amimab's colleague contacted me to notify me that the king would have me sign this signal for a package, without specifying the nature of the package's contents. The king had me sign this signal, giving me two numbers, one for the person from whom I was to collect the package, and the other for the person to whom I was to deliver it. That's when I involved my brother, Sauron Robert. He got in touch with the person concerned and collected the package. I want to make it clear that Robert was just helping me out. When I got the package before he handed it over, I opened it. It was money. There were 8 million. I voluntarily decided to keep 3 million before having Robert deliver the remaining 5 million to the person concerned. Ali Maba's colleague wrote that he would call me on the evening of January 2nd for a mission he wanted to assign to me. Indeed, on the evening of January 2nd, as promised, Colonel Amibama called me to say that the necklace was to be shared between David and me, and the mission he wanted to assign to me was to cut off the pastor's head. I want to clarify that the pastor refers to Captain Passeret, who commands the drone base at Stephanie. Once the pastor's head was cut off, the drones would become inoperative so that the units could go into action. Because, according to Colonel Damiba, the Obisak was the base for the Sapone drones. From his position, Colonel Damiba had set up his command post from which he was in contact with certain people, and he alone knew who they were, to whom he had assigned specific roles. According to Colonel Damiba's schedule, I and all the other operatives were supposed to take action on January 3, 2026 at 11 p.m. I beg your excellency for clemency. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, to the people and to the entire military hierarchy.
What you just heard is not a rumor and not a second-hand claim. It is a direct statement from a serving officer who says he was approached, funded, and instructed as part of an alleged plot. According to his own words, Encrypted messaging apps, disappearing messages, coded language, and cash payments were used. All signs of how modern political conflicts are increasingly fought in silence before they ever reach the streets. Whether one agrees with the government or not, this kind of testimony alone shows that Burkina Faso is facing a moment that goes far beyond politics. It touches on national security, military loyalty, and the question of who truly holds influence behind closed doors. Now, the second clip takes us deeper into how Burkinabe authorities and analysts interpret what this alleged operation represents and where they believe the pressure is really coming from.
Traoré and the most important members of his regime in order to restore a regime that would be the equivalent, quite naturally, of the former regime, of the man who was still, at the time, a lieutenant colonel in the Burkinabe army, Paul-Henri Sandaogo Damiba. We also learn from the Minister of Security of Burkina Faso that all of this was done by mobilizing a number of civil society cells, which, for their part, were intended to raise awareness and organize the population in order to accept this crime. Fifth, and this is an extremely important piece of information, what are the active and undeniable contributions to this coup d'etat? Aside from the former president, former Lieutenant Colonel Paul-Henri Sandaogo Damiba, aside from the soldiers he involved, aside from the civilians he involved, including a businessman named Madi Sakande, who has testified at length and detailed the organization of the operation in an 18-minute video that is available on the page of the Burkinabe Radio and Television. Who are the actors cited outside of Burkina Faso as having actively participated in this umpteenth coup attempt? These actors are from the regime of Alassane Dramane Ouattara in Côte d'Ivoire. I have listened from beginning to end to the Minister of Security of Burkina Faso, and the only time he mentions foreign actors, he explicitly mentions Alassane Dramane Ouattara's Côte d'Ivoire as having been the most important financing hub for the coup attempt. Now, what is Alassane Dramane Ouattara's Côte d'Ivoire? It is the outpost of French neo-colonialism and Western imperialism in West Africa. So we can once again consider this umpteenth coup attempt against President Ibrahim Traoré as the work of French neo-colonialism and Western imperialism. Therefore, what is happening there in Ouagadougou, what is happening there in West Africa, is a carbon copy with some nuances of what is happening in Latin America with Nicolás Maduro. Because if you look at the coup d'etat that was perpetrated against Nicolás Maduro in Latin America, you will realize that it is exactly the same neo-colonialist and Western imperialist actors who are the backers of these operations to bring down the sovereigntist regimes that refuse to submit to the dictates of Western imperialism, to the dictates of Middle Eastern imperialism on the planet. So what I find troubling in the report that the Minister of Security of Burkina Faso has just given is that he doesn't explicitly mention, he doesn't mention anywhere, he doesn't accuse the authorities of the Togolese Republic, which is currently hosting Lieutenant Colonel Paul, the former Lieutenant Colonel, because he no longer is, Paul-Henri Sandaogo Damiba. And I asked my friends on social media to listen, instead of just being content with hearing. Listen, instead of just being content with hearing. I listened to the Minister of the Interior, of Security of Burkina Faso. He mentions the Ivory Coast. He doesn't mention Togo a single time. And so in this report from Minister Mahamadou Sana, the question I ask myself is to know what then is the ultimate role of Togo in this affair. Togo, which is the republic that is hosting as a political refugee, as a political exile, who is hosting Paul-Henri Sandaogo Damiba. That is the question that the official Burkinabe report leaves unanswered. And when the authorities of our Pan-Africanist government of Burkina Faso leave a question unanswered, it means that it's a question that is open to our reflection. We must think. Why doesn't Burkina Faso accuse Togo by name of being associated with the coup attempt against it? If Burkina Faso doesn't do it, it means that the Burkinabe authorities know that Paul-Henri Sandaogo Damiba did not act with the approval of the Togolese authorities. Write that down. And everyone here must show some common sense. President Ibrahim Traoré is not someone, the government of Ibrahim Traoré is not a government of sycophants. It's not a government of deceivers. It's not a government of people who use double speak. Okay? If he does not accuse the Togolese Republic, we shouldn't rush to accuse it. Now, we must ask ourselves, what is Damiba's status? What is the nature of Damiba's stay in the Togolese Republic? So then, first hypothesis. When Damiba was overthrown on September 30th, 2022, if I'm not mistaken, there were two possibilities for Damiba. No, there were three possibilities for Damiba. The first possibility, if Damiba, then a lieutenant colonel in the army, tried to resist militarily, was to meet his death where he had taken refuge. Since the units under the command of Captain Ibrahim Traoré were stronger than him, Damiba and his close companions would probably have been killed. As part of the rectification of the revolution, that was the first case. Second case, Damiba could have been arrested and consequently he could have been imprisoned in Burkina Faso by Captain Ibrahim Traoré and his men who controlled the situation and had the massive support of the population. That was the second case. And then the third case, Damiba was to be exiled. He had to leave the soil of Burkina Faso so as to no longer be an obstacle to achieving the objectives of the progressive popular revolution. Which of these three hypotheses was the one chosen? Perhaps a fourth hypothesis, there would have been a confrontation. Perhaps Damiba hoped he could have turned the tables and crushed, well, the seizure of power by Captain Ibrahim Traoré. Damiba never tried because on the ground he saw clearly that if he had tried, the first hypothesis would have happened to him, or in the best case scenario, the second. Either he would have been killed or he would have been arrested. If Damiba did not attempt a military counteroffensive, it is because he did not have the means, and because at one point he thought he could count on France, and it failed him. It could not save him, just as it could not save Bazoum, just as it will not be able to save Ouattara Draman, just as it will no longer be able to save anyone in quote-unquote Francophone Africa. Well, let's remain calm. Let's analyze this matter. So there were three serious hypotheses. Either Damiba, first hypothesis, Damiba wanted to resist, and that would have been a bloody conflict with the troops under the command of President Traoré. And it is probable that Damiba would have been killed along with several of his men. Second hypothesis, Damiba resisted and without being killed was arrested, and he would have gone to prison, and he would currently be in prison in Burkina Faso, no doubt. Third hypothesis, Damiba would leave. And for him to leave, the new authorities of Burkina Faso had to agree for him to leave. Those authorities even had to agree on his destination. And so when Damiba leaves Burkina Faso to take refuge in Togo, my analysis leads me to say he took refuge there with the agreement of both authorities. He took refuge in Togo because President Ibrahim Traoré allowed him to leave. Because if President Ibrahim Traoré had wanted to kill or arrest him, he would not have let him leave. He had the military means to neutralize him. Secondly, when he went to Togo, it was perceived on both sides as an acceptable solution to the bloody crisis that was threatening to break out in Burkina Faso and to the bloodbath that was likely to occur. To the detriment, of course, of Damiba and his followers, but also to the detriment of Burkina Faso, which has already experienced bloodbaths. Because the situation in September 2022 was such that blood was going to be shed, just like in October 1987. Blood was going to be shed. Like in October 2014, if there hadn't been an amicable solution. And it is thanks to this amicable solution that Damiba is in exile in Togo. And public opinion needs to understand this. Now, the question is this. Will the Togolese Republic continue to allow someone who is on its soil as part of an amicable agreement with the Burkinabe authorities? Will it allow this person, Paul-Henri Sandaogo Damiba, to continue taking initiatives to destabilize the country that allowed him to leave? Will the Togolese Republic be comfortable in its relationship with Burkina Faso? Will it be comfortable in its relationship with the alliance of Sahel states while having a Damiba who is becoming uncontrollable, a Damiba who is acting like a free electron and who continues to plot against Burkina Faso from Côte d'Ivoire? It's no coincidence that he is operating mainly from Côte d'Ivoire. The minister's report, Mahamadou Sana, tells us that the implementation was facilitated from Côte d'Ivoire, not from Togo. But can Togo be comfortable continuing to host someone on its soil who was sent there with the agreement of Burkina Faso? Because if Burkina Faso wanted to kill Damiba on the spot in September 2022 or arrest him, it would have done so. Burkina Faso did not do it. So, the answer to this question, can Togo remain in this uncomfortable position of being the land that hosts the one who wants to overthrow the government of Burkina Faso, without necessarily actively participating in facilitating his operations? Can Togo endure this discomfort? My answer is no. My answer is no, because it is likely that Damiba was accepted in Togo on the condition that from Togo, he would no longer destabilize Burkina. And Burkina Faso allowed Damiba to flee to Togo because Burkina Faso probably received some guarantees from Togo that from within Togo, there would be no destabilization against him coming from Damiba. There you have the first part of my analysis. Now, I will do the second part of my analysis of the information given to us by, well, the Divisional Commissioner Mahamadou Sana, Minister of National Security of Burkina Faso. Listen, I hear the objections from the agents of France-Afrique on social media. I hear the objections from the agents of France-Afrique in the Burkinabe opposition. I hear the objections from the agents of, well, French neocolonialism and Western imperialism, who, in the name of their democracy, their so-called good governance, in the name of political criteria that the West itself proclaims without ever respecting them. The West, with its 12 monarchies and its criminal powers. In the name of those criteria, they believe that President Ibrahim Traoré's regime is a dictatorship, and that as such, this regime deserves coup d'etat. Better yet, they say, Captain Ibrahim Traoré himself came to power through a coup d'etat, so it is normal for him to constantly face coups d'etat, because that is the path he himself took to come to power. He cannot stop others from, well, taking the very same path. I would like once again to respond here to this deceitful propaganda, to this inaccurate propaganda, to this ideologically moronic propaganda, by reminding you of this. We must remember the reasons why Captain Ibrahim Traoré, who, by the way, had participated as part of the MPSR-1 in the coup d'etat of the then Lieutenant Colonel Paul-Henri Sandaogo Damiba, we must understand why, on September 30th, 2022, there was a rectification of the Burkinabe revolution. Why was there an MPSR-1 that was replaced by the MPSR-2? The major political problem that Burkina Faso is currently facing as a nation at this time, and which could not be solved by President Compaoré, nor by the successive presidents Zida, Kafando, Kabore, nor the former president Paul-Henri Sandaogo Damiba. What is the fundamental problem of Burkina Faso? This fundamental problem is that Burkina Faso is in the turmoil of the great destabilization of imperial terrorism, which was designed by NATO as part of its project for the total recolonization of Africa in order to seize its tremendous natural resources: uranium, gold, manganese, cobalt, and so on, oil, diamonds. Burkina Faso is caught in this spiral. What has characterized all the political regimes after President Thomas Sankara, assassinated on October 15th, 1987, by the men of the one who was his number two, Captain Blaise Compaoré. What has characterized all of Burkina Faso's regimes in the face of this issue of the great terrorist destabilization? Listen to me carefully, and that is where you will understand the revolutionary legitimacy of the coup d'etat, perpetrated on September 30th, 2022 by Captain Ibrahim Traoré. A legitimacy that gives him a moral, ideological, political superiority, a spiritual superiority over attempts like those of Paul-Henri Sandaogo Damiba. Because not all coups are created equal. As I have explained many times before, revolutionary coups are carried out for the unfulfilled aspirations of the people, while reactionary coups are carried out for foreign, neo-colonialist, and imperialist interests. The only coups that are morally and politically useful to any nation on this earth are revolutionary coups. They are what break the deadlock and allow the legitimate aspirations of the people to be fulfilled. Whereas reactionary coups, neo-colonialist coups, civilian coups constitutional coups that are carried out for dictators serving foreign interests, those must be fought every single day until the end of time. Under President Blaise Compaoré, the strategy was to host the leaders of terrorist organizations in Burkina Faso so that these terrorist organizations would not attack Burkina Faso. The main leaders of Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State roamed freely in Burkina Faso, just as they roam freely now in Algeria under Abdelmadjid Tebboune. Just as they roam freely now in Qatar, they roam freely in Saudi Arabia. We have even seen them walk the red carpet in Paris and in Washington. We've even seen them at the UN. Under President Compaoré, the strategy to protect his country was to be complacent with the leaders of terrorist groups in exchange for non-aggression against Burkina Faso. President Compaoré believed that this was the wisest strategy since he knew that these terrorist groups are groups of mercenaries for the West. And since he believed he was militarily incapable of confronting them, he preferred to adopt a sort of non-aggression policy towards them, signing a non-aggression pact with them, a kind of policy of turning a blind eye, of looking the other way. And it was on that basis that he tried to preserve the security of Burkina Faso. When Blaise Compaoré falls, and this protection from the state of Burkina Faso is no longer guaranteed to the main leaders of the terrorist groups, what do we observe? They completely unleash themselves against Burkina Faso and they attack it. That is when the fall accelerates, Burkina Faso's descent into hell. President Zida, who was president for a few days, and then President Kafando are not able to truly deal with this issue. They were solely focused on reorganizing institutions, reorganizing elections, the transfer of power, and so on. President Rochmark's Christian Kaboré comes to power. Rochmark Christian Kaboré inherits a situation in which terrorist groups are now unleashed against Burkina Faso. And what characterizes the governance of Rochmark Christian Kaboré? It's that he spends his time decreeing national days of mourning, whining, but he doesn't change the structural policy of the anti-terrorist fight in Burkina Faso. What was the limit of the structural anti-terrorist policy in Burkina Faso? It's that under Compaoré, under Kafando or Zida, under Rochmark Christian Kaboré, the Burkinabe army was fighting terrorism under the supervision of NATO's armed forces, that is, the United States, France, Great Britain, the European Union, and the UN. However, the terrorist groups Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State were created by the NATO powers and their allies in the Middle East. So, Burkina Faso was fighting terrorism on its own soil under the aegis of the very ones who implanted terrorism, which meant that the Burkinabe anti-terrorist fight was ineffective. Practically 70% of Burkinabe territory was now under the occupation of terrorists. And the multinationals of Western plunder were preparing to profit from a declaration of secession of the division of Burkina Faso into several emirates that would begin to commercialize the wealth of Burkina Faso to the European Union, to the United States, to England, to the Middle East. Burkina Faso was threatened with partition, and Rochmark Christian Kaboré essentially contented himself with,
The purpose of sharing these voices is not to tell you what to think, but to make sure Africa's stories are heard clearly, directly, and in full context. Because when silence replaces truth, confusion replaces understanding, and Africa has paid that price too many times. If this discussion helped you better understand what is unfolding in the Sahel, gently tap the like button so more people can discover it. Share your thoughts respectfully in the comments. Your voice matters here. And subscribe to Voice of Africa, where African realities are told with dignity, balance, and clarity. Until next time, stay informed, stay grounded, and always stand with Africa.